Hey there, everybody. This is Coliver. We're starting right away here with Game 2. I'm joined with just Klaser at this time. Some technical difficulties, and Diggity is very, very booked with lots of commentaries this weekend, so he decided to leave. And Diggity wanted to leave us with his opinion, which is that Jaedong is going to keep going Hydralisks and keep owning Fantasy. And we're going to see if that prediction comes true. I think, like Diggity said, this map is not necessarily ideal, though, for that kind of build. This is Outsider. Fantasy is up 1-0 with a relatively fun and close game. I think Fantasy, let's give him credit. I mean, he managed to do his classic style of switching from tech to tech, going back and forth from the mechanized tech tree to the medic marine tech tree, something that he was one of the few people who really got started, you know? I mean, mech builds were not common about 2 years ago, and Fantasy was one that always went mech, and he started owning people left and right with it. So give credit to Fantasy, man. I mean, that was a very fun game the first time around. And we'll see what happens. What do you think, Class?
Yeah, I agree with you. Fantasy is definitely a renaissance of Terran. And, actually, people are talking about, well, okay, Jaedong has lost to Fantasy perhaps in the Pro League, but he can't beat him in a best of 5, all that stuff. By the way, this is going to be Outsider, the matchup that Jaedong has had a little bit of trouble with recently in the Pro League. He's struggled a little bit against Kanada, another SK Terran, and he's SK Team 1 Terran, and now he's facing up against Fantasy, and looks like he started up his Overlord here, so we might potentially be seeing a 12 hatch, which could be suicidal if Fantasy goes for that forward 8 racks build that we've seen the SK Terrans employ against Jaedong. Although we saw Jaedong fight it effectively against Fantasy, we saw that epic game in the Pro League with Jaedong against Fantasy. But I just want to remark, and yeah, Jaedong, it looks like he's going to go for either a 12 for a 12 hatch. Fantasy hasn't gotten for an 8 rack still, so he should be okay with that 12 hatch. So perhaps a little bit of mind games going on. Perhaps Fantasy knew that. I wouldn't be surprised if there was this could just all be in my own head. This might just be the voices talking in my head. But I think that there's double mind games going on here. Jaedong knows that Fantasy's not going to do the same thing that they've been doing every single time, and Fantasy knows that Jaedong knows. And so therefore we've ended up with a pretty standard opening on Outsider for these two players. But it has to be said, Jaedong has lost the last 3 games he's played against Fantasy, 2 in the Pro League and 1 here. But Jaedong's actually going to be able to get that scout through and scout Fantasy's base and know exactly what he's up to.
Yep, looks like he is going to spot the gas. I mean, if Fantasy won M&M one of these games, I think it would blow everybody's mind, including Jaedong's. I mean, maybe he should do that, show off some unknown, like, Medic Marine early game skills, because we've never ever seen him do it. I mean, it's so rare when Fantasy does it. Uh-oh, Jaedong going for a 2-hatchery gas here, not going to go for the 3rd hatch like last game. So generally that indicates earlier Mutalisks, or maybe possibly a Lurker build. Generally, obviously, this is going to be a 2-hatchery lair build. So he's not going to have that massive Hydralisks early on. We could be seeing perhaps more vulnerability to the Vulture drop or to a Valkyrie build. We're going to have to see. It looks like Fantasy is going to scout, of course. He's going to get in, spot this. He knows as well as I do that this means faster tech. Jaedong, of course, I mean, honestly, if he can stick to Spire units, I actually think he does better. I think just Scourge, obviously he is the best player in the world with Scourge. I have never ever seen anyone so good as he is at sniping stuff. I mean, everything. Corsairs, shuttles, Mutalisks, whatever, you name it. And he is obviously very good with the Mutalisks, also one of the best. So, I don't know. I mean, maybe the Mutalisk build, which certainly does work against mechs sometimes, might be something he could try, especially on this map. We're just going to see.
Yeah, and just looking at Jaedong's face there a moment ago, and that's a fan, I think that might be a Jaedong fan who looks worried. She's reflecting Jaedong's own face, and now Starport going down from Fantasy. So Fantasy putting that Starport down, it'll be interesting if he puts an armory down because he has seen Jaedong's build. And I think Jaedong making a little bit of a mistake. If he's going to go for this sort of build, he has to make some sort of effort to block the scout. Because there's no point going for a 2-hatch build like this and just completely letting your opponent know what's coming. Now starting up the lair in his natural expo. Fantasy with that machine shop spinning away, however, still no sign of an armory. But it'll be interesting to see if Fantasy does decide to get that Valkyrie out. But yeah, he's going to be in a decent position. I think he's I don't think he's going to go for the drop personally. I'm not seeing the control. And Jaedong now is putting his Spire down. So Jaedong has started his Spire. So Fantasy knows exactly what Jaedong is doing. And really, he should be in a good position to defend against this. And I really feel that, and yeah, Fantasy's going to produce a couple of raids out, it looks like, just to supplement his forces. But yeah, I think that if you're going to go... for Jaedong, I feel this is a make or break game. He looks nervous to me. He looks bedraggled, and this is not the Jaedong that I'm used to seeing. I'm used to seeing him supremely confident. I'm used to seeing him almost arrogant against his opponents, and he definitely doesn't look anything like that in this game. Looks like Fantasy is now getting ready to take his natural expo as well. He's just positioned that SCV out there. Again, no sign of that armory as of yet from Fantasy. but putting a couple of spider mines down. But yeah, I think this game is make or break for Jaedong, because if he loses this game, that would have been 4 losses in a row against Fantasy. He'd be 2-0 down in the series, and I think he would really struggle to bounce back from that.
I definitely agree with you there. I mean, Jaedong, for once, one of the few times I've ever seen Jaedong looking tired and stressed in this series so far. You know, Jaedong is facing the same kind of pressure as Flash did, let's not forget, for about a year. He was the only really great player on KTF, other than Reach, who only played 2v2, unfortunately. But he was the only real great player on KTF. He was holding up KTF. He was also in both Star Leagues, winning and not winning some of them. But, you know, obviously Flash right now is not necessarily the best anymore. He really isn't necessarily even in the S class, although some would argue in that. And you know, it was just a lot of stress, a lot of pressure. Looks like Jaedong's going to go for that build where he's going to get a couple of Hydras and then switch back or switch into his Mutalisk build. Jaedong right now facing pressure though from Wraiths. This Wraith could be in trouble. There we go. Jaedong catching Fantasy with his pants down a little bit. That Wraith goes down. Jaedong actually has built a lot of Hydralisks. This is actually a little bit unexpected, perhaps to me and Fantasy. This could be a little bit of a surprise tech switch here because he's actually gone for lots of Hydras. I think he got speed upgrade too. So Fantasy has gone for a science facility. Not going to help him at all. The science facility useless against mass Hydras, of course. And Jaedong could be pounding down the front door very soon with a surprise move here that would actually explain why he allowed that scout to live so long and see the spire. We're gonna have to find out.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. That this was planned by Jaedong. Now sniping that spider mine. Those are the only things that are keeping Jaedong at bay right now. And Fantasy laying down those in layers. He's got that siege tank out as well. If he can get siege mode research, this is going to be really close. If that siege mode goes up, then Jaedong's attack will probably fail. And Jaedong obviously trying to feint Fantasy in there. And you can see now the concentration coming back on Jaedong's face. That Overlord inching forward agonizingly slowly. Fantasy managed to run about 3 vultures behind Jaedong's forces. Again, he's going to try and perhaps put some spider mines down to prevent reinforcements from joining in. But Jaedong trying to close in within range of that. I don't think he's going to be able to close in before the siege mode is up for Fantasy. Jaedong is, I don't know who's going to get in time. Another 3 vultures coming in. One is definitely going to get through. One is going to get through. 2 get taken down. 1 gets through. And Jaedong is going to be forced to pull back his vultures. And now that 1 vulture is going to be able to lay havoc to his drone lines. Although I don't think he's going to be able to do enough damage quickly enough. And Fantasy has done a great job. Even though he was caught off guard, I think he's done a great job of defending against this. And now trying to take that 1 vulture down with about 4 or 5 drones. He's going to lose at least a couple of drones here, and considering that he's only gone on a 2 hatchery build, he has got a 3rd hatchery of course, but he started initially with a 2 hatchery build, which means his economy isn't as strong as it could be. So Fantasy has seen off this initial pressure from Jaedong, but meanwhile Jaedong, however, has secured that 3rd expo, but it's a min-only expo, so it's not like he's completely eating up the gas and swallowing up the gas, but he's going to take that final vulture down before it does any more damage. And yeah, he's now taking that gas-only expo as well, so this game is going to go a little bit further on, and it'll be interesting to see how the resources Jaedong has invested in this. I mean, obviously they haven't really paid off, and it'll be interesting to see how this transitions into the late game. Fantasy's already got that science vessel out. He's got a couple of siege tanks out. He doesn't have a decent-sized medic and marine force yet, though, to supplement that science vessel and really go roaming with it. So I'm not sure if he's ready to make a push anytime soon. And Jaedong meanwhile has got that hive up. So it's still anybody's game, I feel. But Fantasy definitely has countered Jaedong well there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually surprised that Jaedong just didn't build a couple of Lings or just sacrifice like 1 Hydra, just run in. There's Fantasy building 4 racks, but I do think that Jaedong, I mean, had a golden opportunity there to win the game when he had 8 Hydras and Fantasy had a bunker and a tank without siege mode, and that was it. He had no medic. He has no medics. He had no stim. He's just now finishing his academy. Jaedong has some lurkers too. He knows he has to transition now to more traditional tech, but man, I feel like he lost an opportunity there. I think he needed to be actually more pushy there. I mean, Fantasy didn't have much to counter with either at that point. It just really, I think that was a mistake. Jaedong could have taken that opportunity, I feel, and I think because he didn't take it, he is slightly behind here, or perhaps significantly behind. I'm not sure exactly, because he doesn't have that 3rd gas like you're saying. He didn't have it. That 3rd base is a min only. Fantasy right now has a just uber safe front door there. There's no way Jaedong is going to get through there without defilers at least. And Fantasy has his tech tree rounded up now. He has his medic marines going. I would say actually he's in a pretty secure position. Jaedong though does have his hive. He is going to probably have a, yeah, there's the defiler mound. So I mean, Jaedong not out of the game by any means. Obviously he will have 4 gas up because of that double gas. So I think both players even, but I still feel that Jaedong missed a bit of opportunity there when Fantasy didn't have much to reply with. I don't know what you think about that, Class, as we move into the late game here.
Yeah, Fantasy did a brilliant job though. He sniped the lone Zergling that Jaedong did bring up to try and eat up some of the spider mines, but I agree with you that Jaedong should have then countered by just sacrificing a Hydralist in the process and putting the pressure right back on Fantasy. But now Jaedong is in Jaedong, that's the difference in Outsider. An Outsider Zerg player can come back because of that double gas. And Fantasy now trying to push forward with those Medic and Marine groups, but Jaedong is going to hold him off. A couple of Scourges just sitting idly there, and I'm surprised Fantasy isn't taking these down. They're just sitting and hovering over Fantasy siege tanks, just out of range of that Science Vessel, almost within a fingertips reach, but just beyond. If Jaedong can snipe that Science Vessel, that'll be huge because that'll allow him to last a lot longer in the game. Now he finally moves those Scourges a little bit further back. He's now got that Defiler in play in a decent position on the map, but Fantasy's got a lot of army there. Now Fantasy spotting those Scourges finally takes one of them out, which means that Jaedong's not going to be able to snipe that Science Vessel as he comes in for this attack on Fantasy's forces, trying to effect a flank. Fantasy's got a good circle here though, and Jaedong's lurkers are running into a kill zone, and Fantasy's just going to be able to move his troops out, and ouch, that was horrible for Jaedong. He's just lost his entire army, but he has managed to isolate Fantasy's tanks a little bit, but he's not really killed anything. He might kill one tank here if he's lucky, and he doesn't even kill the one tank, and now Fantasy's just going to go into siege mode again. That Defiler is gone, and Fantasy's cutting off Jaedong's reinforcements, so Jaedong is really up against it right now. Fantasy now knocking on that front door, and that was the critical thing for me to really worry about for Jaedong, is that yes, that double gas does allow a player like Jaedong to get back into a game when he might be a little bit behind. But the key for him is going to be defending that front door. If Fantasy can keep the pressure up, and before Jaedong can really get those defenses up, he should be able to take the game. But Jaedong is doing a good job of delaying that push from Fantasy with those lurkers, but he's lost his entire army in the process. Man. He has got a few units at this front door, but Fantasy's entire army is alive and continue to grow, and Jaedong hasn't sniped a single Science Vessel thus far. So I would say Jaedong really under the cosh right now. He's going to be under a lot of pressure to hold his front door. If he can hold it, he has a chance, I think, of taking this game still in the long term. But now he's pushing out with a couple for the Hydralists and a decent unit combination with Lurkers as well, just trying to keep Fantasy away for as long as possible. But he needs to start sniping those Science Vessels.
I really like Fantasy's build that he doesn't expand to his third. He plays aggressively at this point with a little bit of a low resource build, but he gets more units out. But Jaedong, let's not count him out. Never count Jaedong out. He advances with a Hydra Lurk force, and he gets a Vessel. Much better attack than before, when he totally just failed. I mean, basically, he got nothing. He scared Fantasy's tanks. That's what happened to them. They got scared, and then they lived. Very, very unfortunate for him. That was a slightly better advance. Not going to put him ahead or anything, though, but it's going to relieve some pressure. Those Hydras are going to be pretty useful there because they obviously actually do okay against Science Vessels. They shoot up, certainly, and they're not horrible against tanks either. They're bad against M&M, of course. But Plague is good. He gets a couple units there. Jaedong, though, no Swarm. Man, advancing into M&M, not a good idea with just pure Hydras. He's got to run with those Hydras. Those Hydras not going to be very useful. Jaedong, though, picks off another Science Vessel. Fantasy down to 2, one of them plagued. Fantasy has his third, though. Fantasy always gets this late third. I don't know if you've noticed it, viewers, but it's a slightly different build from what, say, Flash would do. He would pick up his third much earlier. At the same time, though, his his early late game push would be weaker. Fantasy really just focuses all of his resources into getting this tank medic marine force. He leaves himself a little open economically, though. Jaedong this time, though, I mean, he is not out of the game. He is doing okay because he's expanded all around the map. This being outsider, that upper left was invulnerable this entire time except by drop. So Jaedong right now has picked up, 4 gases. He's kept them, now trying to defend his upper right. I don't know if he can do it. He's got Hydras and now Lurker Eggs defending that ramp. Oh, man, this is actually going to be really effective here. Jaedong, no! He barely manages to, Fantasy barely manages to get up the ramp because Jaedong didn't have enough in the way of lurkers. Now Fantasy is up. He's going to pick off the morphing hatchery. Jaedong right now really wants to take down another expansion here, or build up another expansion because he knows his clock is ticking here. Fantasy's got his third, and 3 versus 4, I mean, the Terran wins in that situation.
Yeah, Jaedong now coming in with a Hydralist of little lurkers. He should at the very least be able to take down this medic and marine group. Now Fantasy coming in with the dropships. Jaedong trying to snipe it with the Scourges. One Scourge manages to land, but the dropships are intact. However, Jaedong's going to be aware of what's coming because he has spotted those 2 dropships, so he should be decently positioned to defend against this. Those Marines are going to do a little bit of harass. Now Jaedong with an Observer. He's going to have to pull those drones away. He's not pulling those drones. Now he's pulling the drones away. His Fantasy drops right on top of them. Jaedong obviously waiting for something to pop. I don't think he's got a Nidus in there, though. You're right. He doesn't have a Nidus, and Jaedong is going to... He does have a Nidus. The Nidus is there, and now he's got reinforcements coming in. brilliant play, takes all of the Marines, and Jaedong is going to clean up at that 1 o'clock expo, as well as, and actually Fantasy's managed to keep his Marines alive, and now he's pounding away at that hatchery, and he's going to kill one of the hatcheries. That's not the critical hatchery though, because that's not the double gas hatchery. Jaedong with more Hydralisk popping through that Nidus is going to be able to clean up the remainder of Fantasy's forces. So now Jaedong is in a strong position. You're absolutely right about Fantasy's build, where he focuses on putting that kind of early pressure and preventing the Zerg player from kind of trying to get a third hatchery or a third base. And that's quite effective on normal maps, but this is Outsider, and I think Fantasy might have perhaps been a little bit too fastidious in his choice of strategy, might have been a little too stringent with himself, because Outsider is a map where a Zerg can, if they get those defilers up, especially with Jaedong managed to get them early up. Remember, he did go for that 2 hatchery build, so he had a faster tech tree, and was therefore able to get those defilers up in time to hold Fantasy up, and while and as long as the Zerg player can hold off the Terran at their front door alone, they can take 2 more gas, which you cannot do on any other map, or very few other maps where you just have to hold your front door and you can have 4 gas. And that's what a Zerg player can do on Outsider that they can't do anywhere else, which is what makes him so lethal late game. And you've got to feel that Jaedong is now in the driving seat in this match, in a match that I feel is a must-win for him to get some confidence back.
Absolutely, this is a Zerg favorite map in my opinion, although the statistics don't really bear it out too much. I think it's pretty close statistically. Looks like Jaedong has a very nice force here, lots of lurkers, and now a swarm. Fantasy venturing out with just a M&M Firebat build, or a group rather, and that's not enough. He doesn't have tanks anymore, or he does have some in his base, but he lost a nucleus of his army, which are those precious siege tanks. And this time, I think Fantasy is not going to get up the ramp. He also, loses a science vessel. A little bit poor micro there, and Jaedong is the master of Scourge, as I've said. Fantasy now getting his 3rd harass. That's going to be horrible for him. He does have a 4th at the bottom left, though, and he loses an army out in the field. Jaedong now in the lead for sure in this game, and possibly securing the victory here, basically, by his multiple harassments, and by stopping Fantasy here. I think really this map played well into Jaedong's hands. Jaedong has dropped. He's gotten some cracklings into the bottom left base of Fantasy. Fantasy, of course, being a Terran player, is mined out now in his main, almost in his natural expansion, and he needs these 2 bases. One of these 2 is now gone. Jaedong, I think, has this game. He has way too many bases now and way too many units for Fantasy to contend. So it looks like I am going to have to call it. This time it's very clear that Jaedong just has the game here. Very well defended by Jaedong, I gotta say.
Yeah, Jaedong defended brilliantly at his front door, and that was absolutely critical, and now he's putting Fantasy under the cosh. Fantasy obviously limited to only mining at his natural expo, as well as that expo at the 330 position. I think he's managed to just about save that expo at the 6 o'clock position, that min only. He's just about managed to save it and repair it from Jaedong's cracklings, but Jaedong putting pressure now at Fantasy's front door, coming in with a Hydralisk as well as lurkers. Fantasy being forced right back into that choke. That's going to be hard for Jaedong to break, though. That's the problem, that Terran can defend well in this matchup, and we have seen Fantasy bounce back, although I don't think it was this sort of situation that he bounced back from. I think that game was a lot more even. Remember, Jaedong had spent so much in the Pro League on that matchup on those Guardians that really didn't pay out for him, and those were obviously his undoing in that matchup. But here, Jaedong has got map control. He's got bases all over the place. Fantasy's not able to put any pressure on him. Fantasy hasn't got those drops going. Jaedong has shut them out, and now Jaedong looks like he's coming in with another drop at that 6 o'clock expo. Fantasy with only a small group of Medic and Marines, and Jaedong dropping lurkers and Hydralisks, and he's going to clean this out. And I don't think Fantasy's going to save this. Fantasy with his latch dip. This is Fantasy's Hail Mary here, coming with the 2 dropships, but those dropships still floating around in the air, not getting anywhere, and he's now dropping up on top of that ridge just near the National Expo of the 12 o'clock main, and meanwhile he's going to lose his command center at the 6 o'clock position to those Hydralisks, and Jaedong meanwhile coming in with lurkers as well. He's going to clear out Fantasy's units that he dropped on top of that ridge. Bunch of lurkers coming in to drop. Fantasy does have Medic and Marines. He's going to try and kill at least a couple of lurkers, but that scan wears, he loses the Marines, and he's going to lose the rest of that force from the dropship, and that's going to be pretty much it, I think, for Fantasy. He's managed to get a decent sized force of tanks and Marines, but he's not, as you said earlier, he's now, I think, restricted to mining something like 1 base as well as perhaps at his natural, and Jaedong is mining from a lot more. So yeah, Jaedong is probably going to take this game. Fantasy got that big push out, but Jaedong has got a good force in the middle of the map too.
Yeah, I mean, Jaedong right now just needs to take down this force or defend successfully. We're going to see if that happens. Fantasy has gotten a large force, of course, and Jaedong has, looks like, +3 Carapace, and Fantasy is not going to be able to beat that, obviously, with any kind of upgrade. we're going to have to see. I mean, Jaedong is a huge force, but so is Fantasy. Jaedong now moving in with this large force. There's a Dark Swarm. Hydra Lurker here seems to be the order of the day against this M&M tank force. And Jaedong getting some swarms in. He's not getting the best burrows, but now he has forced this force to break into half here. This is, this is what the Zerg player needs to do to get the tanks away from their supporting units. They're supporting infantry, and Jaedong's going to finish the tanks off, it seems, with some Zerglings, and the Marines perhaps with some Lurkers. Yeah, Jaedong is going to, he's going to do that. Just three Lings there are probably going to take care of that whole group of tanks. Jaedong with just more Lurkers than there are units, I think, for Fantasy now at the upper right. And I think Fantasy is going to have to call it after this. He loses this force. Yeah, this force is completely decimated, completely wiped out here. And Jaedong really has Fantasy on the ropes. He, I think, has secured victory, but Fantasy, of course, is going to try everything he can to stay in these games. Every game counts here. Fantasy obviously fighting for his, his first gold medal at some point, hopefully for him, and OSL titles are hard to get by. Although Fantasy somehow has managed to keep getting into the finals. I mean, honestly, the semifinals this time, but into the late stages. Very incredible play by him. And really, Fantasy still fighting with every ounce of his strength, but the resources just stack up way too far against him.
Yeah, Fantasy. I hope Fantasy doesn't end up as being Stork of Terran. That would be pretty sad for him. Although Stork's Fairy Tale did have a happy ending. Let's not forget Stork's Fairy Tale did have a happy ending. Fantasy now coming in to clear out that Expo just south of the 12 o'clock position, but Jaedong with a large army continuing to kill. And I think that's the difference between this game and the game that Jaedong lost on the Outsider, where he was so far ahead. There's a couple of big differences. Firstly, he's continued to kill Fantasy's army. He hasn't let Fantasy build up his army and lost units and not traded them in, which he was. He was throwing away a lot of units against Fantasy ineffectually in that game. That hasn't happened this time around, although Fantasy is trying to do a good job of keeping those science vessels alive, not being as effective at it this time around as he would like to. And Jaedong chasing those science vessels down with the Hydras and the Scourges. Those science vessels running desperately for their lives. 3 of them do manage to reach cover of Fantasy's emerging army, but you can see you can see the confidence returning to his facial features. You can actually see in his countenance he's much more confident in himself, and he feels he's got this game in hand, and I think he does. And once he takes, I think this is a huge game. This could be the turning point here for Jaedong, finally registering a win against Fantasy in the 4th game that they've played consecutively against each other. Once he registers this win, that's going to be absolutely huge. The other factor is that Jaedong had a bunch of Ultralisks previously against Fantasy and no real army to counter Fantasy's massive army. That's not the case this time around. Jaedong has stuck to Lurkers and Hydralisks. He's supplemented with Hydralisks and Zerglings, so he's not just counting on a few big units to break down his opponent, and once he loses them, he had nothing left to defend. He's using smaller army, which is quicker and easier to replace, and so therefore he can keep coming back, and he hasn't had to spend thousands upon thousands of gas on upgrading those Ultralisks either, which again means that he's managed to have a much more active army out in the field. So he's basically anticipated the kind of style and adapted to the kind of style Fantasy plays on Outsider and plays versus him. And yeah, even though Diggity's prediction about Jaedong's build wasn't really accurate, I think Diggity's prediction that Jaedong is adapting better to the matchup and is going to go from strength to strength, I think I'm going to have to agree with that this time around.
Yeah, I really do like this Hydra's build. It's actually pretty good against this against the tank Marine Science Vessel build, because Ultralisks are very vulnerable against Science Vessels, but a Hydra Lurker build, not so much. I mean, they can get the Defilers, but Hydralisks actually are very good anti-air. You don't have to get lucky with a Scourge. You can just consistently keep these Overlords away, whereas if you ever see, a standard ground army from Zerg, the Overlords, I mean, the Science Vessels just fly around everywhere, and with impunity, basically. GG coming from Fantasy. Fantasy deciding to type it in here, and very, very exciting and close series so far. Fantasy had lots of moments this game too, where I felt he was close to victory. So, I mean, definitely exciting to watch. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with pretty much what you said here. Jaedong showing that he is as adaptable as Fantasy is creative, and we're gonna have to see what happens.
Yeah, Jaedong definitely researching adaptive armor there, although I know that's not a tech in StarCraft before anyone says. But yeah, Jaedong researching the secret tech. That's going to be in StarCraft 2, adaptive armor. And his adaptive armor holds out. And yeah, you can see the confidence back. He's now believing in himself, and Game 3 is going to be all that much more exciting for it.